LNG, natural gas that has been liquefied for storage and transportation purposes. In this episode of Commodity Brief, we're going to be looking at LNG. This is liquefied natural gas. Now, it's important to make the distinction between LNG and LPG. LNG, natural gas, which it comes out of the ground in that state and then needs to be liquefied for transportation. LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which is a byproduct of the refining of crude oil and then needs to be liquefied and transported to become LPG. Now, in terms of LNG, we're looking at very, very large quantities. The annual production is about 3.5 trillion cubic meters. The world trade, we're looking at about 250 million tons traded annually. However, there are only about 410 vessels in the world fleet, vessels such as this. When we're looking at LNG, we have to look at the natural gas itself. So if we look at the production and the consumption, first of all, in terms of the production, here we're looking at United States is the largest single producer with about 23% of the world share, followed by Russia, Iran, Qatar. On the consumption side, again, United States is the largest single consumer and they have about 22% of the world share, followed by Russia and China. Here you can see it's quite interesting that, first of all, Russia, their percentage share is considerably less than their production because they export quite a lot, whereas we can see that the United States, it's very similar. This was not the case a couple of years ago before we started fracking for natural gas, and that time, the United States used to import a lot of natural gas and they had all of their infrastructure built up for those imports. Now they have become essentially self-sufficient in natural gas, and the first facility for exporting came online quite recently, and so we'll probably see the United States become a net exporter of natural gas in the future. In terms of the exports and the imports of liquefied natural gas, so once it's been liquefied, then we see, first of all, the largest exporter is Qatar, followed by Australia. Off the coast of Australia, there are very, very large production facilities. Shell has just put in place a massive production facility, which is essentially a floating refinery. On the import side, we're looking at Japan, by far the largest importer in the world, followed by South Korea and China. In terms of the transportation, we're seeing it transporting very large vessels, and when we're looking at the uses, basically we're looking at power generation, and we're also looking at cooking and heating. As I said, with the transportation, we're looking at very, very large vessels for the transportation. We're looking primarily at ports, the same port to the same port, because the infrastructure that has to be put in place is very, very expensive, and so it's very difficult to suddenly change destinations or the ports that are being used. The vessels themselves, we tend to see quite large vessels, as I said, and the one limitation we have is called the Qmax. This is the largest size that can go into Qatar, and that's about 130,000 tons of cargo, vessels of about 340 meters long. Now, within these vessels, you have these large tanks which are coated on the inside, often with stainless steel, and they have to be very, very robust to handle this LNG, which has been transported at very, very low temperatures. Otherwise, in terms of the risk, LNG itself in liquid form is not particularly flammable. However, as soon as you have some evaporation, then that gas can be very, very flammable and very, very dangerous. Otherwise, if the LNG itself comes into contact with water, then you can have a quite nasty explosion. And so all of these LNG carriers have very sophisticated systems in place to handle any boil off of the cargo itself. So that brings us to the end of looking at LNG, liquid natural gas, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Commodity Brief. Please click back soon for another episode looking at different subjects. Thank you.